Hello, you're watching Global Insight with me, Withthe. From Arirang News Centre in Seoul, we speak with experts from around the world to hear their views on issues making headlines. The Taliban has promised that women's rights will be protected within the boundaries of Islamic law in its first press conference since capturing the Afghan capital. However, most Afghan women, human rights watchers and governments around the world are doubtful. With the militant group's history of repression, brutality and heinous crimes against women and girls just 20 years ago, there is great concern and fear as to what life will look like under the Taliban's rule. The significant gains made in women's fundamental freedoms, job opportunities, education, literacy and life expectancy are at stake. So should the Taliban's reassurances be taken seriously? Today, we're joined by Sahar Maranlu, lecturer in law and socio-legal studies at Essex Law School and Human Rights Centre. We also connect with Rosa Freedman, professor of law, conflict and global development at the University of Reading. Thank you, both of you, for joining us at this inconvenient hour in England. And to go directly into the issue, Dr. Maranlu, it's uncertain whether the Taliban can be trusted to have changed its views on women's rights. But what's pretty clear is what they're capable of, really. Prior to the rise of the Taliban, women in Afghanistan, they were actually protected under law with the Afghan constitution, providing equality for women as early as 1960. And there was also a substantial representation of women in parliament, the public sector, and 40% of doctors in the capital were actually women. So how did the Taliban's rule change the status of women when it grabbed power in 1996?
Well, in 1996, Taliban established a gender discriminatory system where Afghan women's right to work, to education, to health care were broadly violated by Taliban regime. Women's voices and visibility vanished from the public spheres. Girls' schools, especially for girls above 10, were closed, and women students were expelled from the universities. Taliban also prohibited women, female doctors and nurses, to practice. At the same time, prohibited women to be examined by by male doctors and nurses. Women, they were not allowed to appear in the public unless they were escorted by the male family member. One of the major restrictions imposed by Taliban on Afghan women was about the conservative understanding of Islamic dress code. So women, they had to wear a chador or burqa, which was fully covered their bodies with a little, mesh cover through to see. With international pressure on Taliban, Taliban only allow few female doctors and nurses to go back to their practices. And in some cities, such as Kabul and other major cities, few home schools for girls above 10 started to operate. But those women activists that were leading those home schools, they fear for their lives and security under Taliban strict rules and punishments. In other words, there was a frightening war by Taliban against Afghan women's rights and development 20 years ago.
And there's great concern that things are going to revert back to how things were 20 years ago. And Dr. Freeman, the group is saying that they're going to respect women's rights in the framework of the law that they follow. But in what ways do the group's values and treatment of women clash with universal human rights?
I mean, what we have to understand is that we all have human rights, the same human rights, by virtue of being born human, irrespective of our race, our religion, our sex, or any other protected characteristic that makes us who we are. So to talk about respecting women's rights within a framework where women are subjugated and oppressed, right, within an interpretation of Sharia law that most Muslims around the world have shown is not what Sharia means. To say that women can have their rights up to a certain amount goes against this idea of universality of human rights. We would not say that a person from an ethnic minority or a religious minority or any other minority has their rights up to a certain point. We say that we are all human beings and we all have all of our rights. And the idea that today Pakistan is calling for the Taliban to be recognized as the legitimate government of Afghanistan, when the Taliban is already saying that it will only give half the population some of its rights. Today, when the UN Human Rights Council is refusing to send a fact-finding mission to look at human rights violations by the Taliban in Afghanistan, despite the Afghan representation at the Human Rights Council asking for this, shows that the world really doesn't care about the human rights not only of women, but also of ethnic minorities. We're seeing already the absolute grave human rights atrocities against minorities in Afghanistan, but particularly against women as a sex class minority.
Dr. Maranlu, what does the Sharia law actually say about women's rights? And, well, is it fundamentally discriminatory, or is it the Taliban's interpretation of it?
It is really important to mention that there is no singular meaning of Sharia or Islamic law, as there are different schools of thoughts, and within each school of thoughts there are different branches. So Sharia law or Islamic law is open to interpretation, and interpretation is the human action, and mainly in Muslim-dominated countries, it has been controlled by men. However, women's rights in Muslim-dominated population and countries has been always a battlefield for disagreements over how to interpret the Islamic sources within the Islamic jurisprudence between so-called Islamic traditionalists and radical religious scholars, male control values and culture and traditions, and women activists and women groups to demand modern interpretation of Islamic law sources for living in the modern society. So that's why in some countries, for instance, such as Tunisia, women's groups, they have been able to change the law based on a modern interpretation of Sharia law and Islamic law. And in some other Muslim populated countries, there are long lists of discriminatory laws, especially regarding personal status and women's rights to public spheres. However, Taliban interpretation of Sharia law or Islamic sources, primary sources, has no justification, I should say, even based on the most ultra-conservative understanding of the sources. For instance, in Islamic law, women, they have the right to work and they have the right to earn, money and participate in the public life. So that's why maybe some of the Islamic organizations that are regarded as many as ultra-conservative, such as Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, they denounce the Taliban rule as Islamic state. From my perspective and so many women rights activists in Muslim countries, Taliban understanding and interpretation from Islamic sources has no justification based on Islamic law jurisprudence.
Well, during the Taliban regime between 1996 and 2001, Dr. Freedman, women were denied employment and education. They were forced to wear burqa, and they were forbidden from leaving the house without a male guardian. I mean, so many more constraints, of course, but what these measures are, what kind of constraints did they have on women and their socio-economic status? I mean, most importantly, the capacity to really support themselves and live as human beings.
Throughout history, women have been viewed as the property of men. The property of men throughout all religions and all societies, for fathers to sell with a dowry, to a son-in-law, property to be passed from one man to another. Women have been viewed as vessels for men to procreate and to continue their lineage, to continue and have heirs for the male line. you know, throughout recent history, and I mean really recent history, women have fought to have the right to vote, the right to education, the right to own property, the right to participate in public life. What happened under the Taliban rule in the 1990s, what's happening in many other countries, let's be clear, it's not only in Afghanistan. The world's eyes are on Afghanistan right now, and rightly so, and we should not take our eyes off Afghanistan, because the minute that we do, we will see further subjugation and oppression of women. But what happens around the world is that men want to subjugate, they want to oppress women. When you take away the rights of 50% of the world's population, their right to education, their right to autonomy over their bodies, their right to choose when and who they marry. What you end up having is one class, the male class, men who are in charge, and women being sold into sex slavery, children being, and I don't use the word married, right? Children being sold off as sex slaves to men. What you have is women being denied the right to participate in life through education, through jobs, through livelihoods, which makes them dependent on men. And we saw, as a world, we saw what happened under the Taliban rule. We saw what happened under ISIS rule. We're seeing what happens under Boko Haram, trying to take ownership over women. What we're watching right now, the most awful, horrific scenes coming out of Afghanistan while journalists are still able to film, is a group of men using religion, the religion in the way they interpret, and I completely agree with my colleague who knows far more about Sharia and Islamic law than I do, but this is not an interpretation that goes hand in hand with religion. It's an interpretation of a group of men that want to subjugate and oppress women. We're seeing the absolute desperation of women journalists, doctors, women who are educated, who have professions trying to get out of the country. But what about all the women who are being left behind? Those who are not educated, who are not in professions, but who will be just as subjugated and oppressed and harmed by this rule.
Well, Dr. Marinlou, following the Taliban's conquest of Kabul, it's clear that women are already terrified. A head teacher at a girls' boarding school reportedly burned her students' records, and a Copenhagen-based former captain of the Afghan women's national football team, she reportedly appealed to all Afghan sportswomen to remove all traces of their sporting history. What are they so afraid of right now? And should they not follow the Taliban's rules, what would the consequences be for Afghan women?
I imagine Afghan women who lived under the Taliban 20 years ago, they are haunted by the memories of Taliban strict rules and punishment. They remember with fear how Taliban extreme interpretation of the Sharia law impacted negatively the rights, the development and the everyday of living in Afghanistan. Those women, Afghan women, they have little faith that a new Taliban would be any different with the Taliban 20 years ago. So the equal rights under Afghanistan constitution is under the threat. The legal protection by the law, there are, for instance, few landmark law, such as the elimination of violation against women, and there are other law reforms made by the governments after Taliban and by the effort of women groups. All of those legal developments and legal achievements that are under threat. Also, Afghans women rise to work, to education, to participate in political life, to have access to economical and financial resources. All of those rights, which are basic human rights, are under threat. And imagine with this strict male control interpretation of the Sharia by Taliban, with no civil society, active civil society, I should say, because Afghanistan, especially regarding women rights groups, it was very active, and they had really interesting exchange with other Muslim countries, and they were learning from global South experiences. they feel not too safe actually to advocate for women's rights. So with international organizations and charities and foreign embassies leaving Afghanistan at the moment, and with this all human rights activists and women activists, you know, just fearing for their security and for their safety, I think is really unbearable to imagine the fear that Afghan women actually are feeling at the moment. So
And
they have been betrayed.
And Dr. Freedman, as long as the Taliban is in charge, is there any way to protect women's rights and most of all safeguard their safety and security? I mean, what do you hope to see from governments around the world?
I mean, I had great hope, actually, that the UN Human Rights Council, which today held an emergency special session on Afghanistan with a particular focus on women's rights and minority rights, might do something, take some action, including a fact-finding mission into Afghanistan. The very weak resolution that came from the United Nations main human rights body today makes many commentators and people who are observing, including me, worry about what will happen next. We saw in 1997 that the Organization of Islamic States, called the OIC, which is a large political bloc at the United Nations, called for the Taliban to be brought to the Security Council as one of the factions governing Afghanistan. The fear is that more and more countries will start to recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government of Afghanistan, despite it being very clear from the fighting around the country. We only see really reporting from Kabul, but we know that there is fighting against the Taliban around the country. We can see the protests of really brave women who are standing on the streets of Kabul and of other cities, demanding their rights, demanding that they're not forgotten. But as more and more countries like China and Cuba and Russia start to make noises, start to say that they may recognize the Taliban as a legitimate government, that will strengthen the Taliban in terms of them feeling legitimate and them coming through with the interpretations that they say they have of Sharia law, which really undermine, not just undermine, subjugate and oppress women. What we need as an international community is to stand up and stand together and say that we will not tolerate human rights abuses, let alone the grave violations that are already happening, let alone the grave violations that are being threatened. But whether or not the international community can stand together in that way remains to be seen, and that's deeply concerning for all of us.
Well, I'm afraid that's where we must leave as we're out of time. But that was Sahar Maranlu, lecturer in Law and Socio-Legal Studies at Essex Law School and Human Rights Centre, and Rosa Freedman, Professor of Law, Conflict and Global Development at the University of Reading. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And to our viewers, as always, thank you for watching.